Another among the readings, or among the reading recommendations that I have made for you this term, is a book by Louis L'Amour entitled Education of a Wandering Man. I don't know if you've ever heard of Louis L'Amour before. If you like westerns or cowboy stories, then very likely you know of him. If you Google his name, you'll see he has been an incredibly prolific writer, having written over 100 books. Born in 1908, died in 1988, L'Amour was a self-educated adventurer who dropped out of school when he was just a boy, but spent time out on the American frontier learning the old stories from still-breathing frontiersmen, from old soldiers and homesteaders, and from native people who were around during the time of turmoil when the West was taken away from the American Indians in the Indian Wars. L'Amour's book, Education of a Wandering Man, was published posthumously. He wrote it as an account of his own life, of his adventures, his journeys, and of course his wanderings, both literal and metaphoric. He writes in journal form about his time with the old-timers who lived the history that today we only know partially from books. He rode the rails and lived as a hobo, drifting from town to town, literally a wandering man. He became a fine boxer and fought in many matches as a young man against other young men. He worked as a cowboy, living the hard life in the wide open spaces. He toiled hard under grueling jobs. He joined the army during World War II. He went to sea. He lived as a sailor. And he explored far-off places and foreign lands, but every step of the way, he was reading, ladies and gentlemen. I've only included a few short sections from his book, in which he details some of his adventures. I'll leave you to discover them here so as not to ruin the surprise, but much of what you read in those excerpts you'll find is continually related to what Louis was reading at the time of his life. The books we read shape us. Have you ever had that experience? Have you ever come across a book that made such a significant mark upon your life? I once had a student some years ago who was not very remarkable in class. I could tell you he was smart, but really as a teenager he wasn't all very interested at all in learning anything that I had to share with him. He had a very disinterested attitude, in fact, towards school in general, or at least in my classroom. So I thought. Anyway, some years later, he graduated, or some years after he graduated, actually, I saw him again. He'd grown a foot taller, I swear. His hair was long, and he was sporting a beard and an earring. But I could recognize him just fine. And he came to me, and he said the most remarkable thing, ladies and gentlemen. He approached me, gave me a warm, strong handshake, and he told me how much he had appreciated what I had taught him. I didn't even know I taught him anything. And maybe at the time I hadn't. But something of that time, and something haphazard in the mess of things stuck with him. Something I couldn't have predicted or imagined. It was definitely nothing I'd ever planned for. It was not among the government-mandated outcomes or objectives. It wasn't even on my own radar. But it mattered to him. And it must have sunk into his soul soundlessly, like a tiny seed. Or as when a man walks aimlessly through a meadow and a burr catches onto his trousers. We'd read many things that year, but one poem, Robert Frost's Road Not Taken, had somehow gripped this boy. And believe it or not, it had driven him away from his home in his locality, and it sent him on a grand adventure clear across the globe to Africa, where he spent a year on an elephant reserve. And he told me the details of his own wandering adventure and about how this one thing had pushed him there, and about how much this one little thing had meant to him. It struck me deeply at the time that such a little reading, a poem of 20 lines, could send a young man on a personal quest. I've been a failure in many ways, and to many of my students. I'm sure of that, ladies and gentlemen. But in the most preposterous and unpredictable ways, you never know what you do. And the literature you expose to students, and the little tiny burrs and seeds that you place among them, you never know what's going to stick and what's going to matter. You may think you have a great deal of control over what students learn. Dewey talks unceasingly about the importance of engineering good learning experiences for kids, after all, but in my experience, it doesn't really work that way. They get out of your classes what they get out of them. And in the most wonderful ways, they'll learn things that you yourself have no idea about. That's the wanderer's education. The life of stories and books and reading was fully integrated into Louis L'Amour's days. He read 100 books. Actually, he read over 100 books every year. And just to blow your frickin' mind, I've included the appendix, like the bibliography, to his autobiography. It lists all the books he read, cover to cover, from 1930 to 1937. And it doesn't include all the books he read part way, or any of the other items he may have perused. But you can see quite clearly Louis' love of reading and his concern with self-education. And what's more, you can see how his passion for learning has little, if anything, to do with school. Pay particularly close attention as he narrates some of his adventures for you to what he has to say about education. His comments about how we gain an education are quite sobering. They remind me of James Shaw again, in his remark that genuine education is largely a matter of our own private enterprise. A good question to pose when you read Louis L'Amour's autobiography is, how can I cultivate such a love of learning in my own life? Moreover, you might ask, how can I cultivate such an adventuresome spirit among my own students and in my own classroom? Do L'Amour's comments about education excite you and exhilarate you as a would-be teacher? Or do they perplex and confound you? Particularly in their implication that what we do as teachers is maybe not the core of what constitutes a genuine education. What is a genuine education, after all? Another recommendation I have for you, selections I've provided from Gandhi's writings. Gandhi, like Nietzsche and Aurelius, was a man committed to living his life experimentally. And much of what he wrote, like them, takes on a journalized form. His autobiography is aptly named My Experiments with Truth. I have many times asked my grade 10s to read excerpts from Gandhi. What I like best about Gandhi is how he has an idea, considers its nobility, and then experiments with it in his own life. He fiddles around, and then he writes about his own progress or how things went. We talk so much about science as teachers and scientific experimentation. But what about experiments that hit closer to home? What about things that get us out there? And that get our students out there, trying new things and exploring new things. And not just because they're new, but because we've looked into them and because we affirm that they are good for the cultivation of our characters. In the excerpts I provided for you, Gandhi talks a fair bit about satyagraha. Gandhi's example of the practice of satyagraha offers both students and teachers a valuable opportunity for contemplative seeing, aimed at a clearer vision of the lovable. Satyagraha is literally firmness, agraha, in truth, satya. Put another way, it's the steadfast love of what truly is. Gandhi refers to it throughout his writings as soul force. In order to develop such firmness and truth, or soul force, Gandhi contends that each of us must exert efforts to cultivate the cessation of all our earthly desires, of all those passions and thoughts that drive our everyday actions, and that constitute the source of all of our suffering. Speaking of this chastity of spirit, or brahmacharya, Gandhi writes, "To attain the perfect purity, one has to become absolutely passion-free in thought, speech, and action, to rise above the opposing currents of love and hatred, attachment and repulsion." Essentially, in order to practice satyagraha, he contends, I must reduce myself to zero. This statement always shocks students who are used to and demand an education not designed to reduce, but to engorge the self with its ambitions, its dreams, and its thirsts for success and notoriety. Moreover, education systems for the 21st century, lauded by our government, are increasingly concerned with vamping up technological fixations, with tailoring every educational minute in the classroom to the psychomental identity of each student, and with personalizing and individualizing curriculum and curriculum delivery. Indeed, much of the allure of so-called educational technology seems to lie in its power to offer the individual I increased power or control over its environment. In particular, these technologies provide users with variegated abilities to shape their interactions within that environment to their own personal preferences. Hence, the mad rush at the malls to purchase the latest connection to the I in our iPods, our iPhones, and our iPads. In short, the arc of our educational efforts runs exactly counter to the contemplative requirements of brahmacharya for the cultivation of soul force. In Gandhi's time, it was not unusual for thousands of Hindus to flock towards him in pilgrimage in order that they might gaze upon or take darshana from him. That is, by seeing Gandhi, Hindu pilgrims saw some glimmer of the truth of what is. Similarly, in our own classrooms, by seeing Gandhi, that is, by being challenged to wrestle with the truth of his words through carefully guided discussions, our students may likewise be made pilgrims for truth, engaged in contemplative seeing, in darshana. They may perhaps have their love of truth wedded, and their attachments to the psycho-mental I questioned. They may, in this fashion, be led into the orbit of a genuine education directed at their highest happiness in the pursuit of wisdom. And so too, may the teacher who reads Gandhi's words alongside his or her students be reminded of the real meaning of education, thereby lessening some of his or her own suffering amidst the turmoil of the classroom and its constant tendencies towards deterioration and the loss of sight of what is. As you journal and search yourself for self-knowledge, consider this. Just as Gandhi saw that the only real peace and the only true rule must come from within ourselves as an emanation of the proper ordering of the soul in relation to truth, so too must the contemplative teacher recognize that true peace and order in the classroom cannot be brought about by that sort of education that is most sought after by teachers, parents, administrators, policymakers, and students. The education for success will not alleviate suffering of this sort. Only by example, only by embodying the attitudes of Brahmacharya and Satyagraha, and by becoming oneself an example from which one's own students can take darshana, might the teacher alleviate not only his own suffering, but the suffering of others as well. Certainly I've given you many choices for your readings on the topic of journaling and self-knowledge. I don't expect you to have read all these authors, and of course, you don't need to be masters of any of their work. How could you be, having read such a little bit of it, and over such a short period of time? The point of this course isn't for you to master any particular thinker, but rather to try to think out their thoughts experimentally in your own life, and to see what light they might shed upon your own life as a teacher, and as one who must go forth to help students learn. I know you live busy, hectic lives, but I hope at some point, perhaps you will once again return to these or similar readings out of a passion to know yourselves, and because you seek to know what is. These authors all have the same ambition and that same drive. This is what makes them good teachers and worth reading. The next author I would have you taste is Eric Voegelin. Voegelin is a very important political philosopher from the 20th century. Like many other intellectuals of his day, Voegelin had to flee Germany during the Nazi menace. And he took up residence in the United States, where he wrote voluminously in matters of philosophy, history, political science, and religion. His writing is not ordinarily in journal form, but Voegelin has contributed a great deal to the recovery of the meaning of ancient philosophy as a way of life. He's a highly meditative and contemplative thinker and teacher, and if you ever take the time to read his scholarly work in more detail, it'll be very challenging, but you'll find that it contributes a great deal to your own quest for self-knowledge. Voegelin is intimidatingly smart and insightful. I've chosen a selection for you to read from a very short journal-type piece Voegelin included in a larger book of essays entitled Anamnesis. This word anamnesis is a very old and important word in the history of philosophy. It's an ancient Greek word that literally means recollection or remembering. And its significance runs all the way back to Plato or even to Pythagoras. We've already heard A.G. Sardalanges talk a little bit about the importance of recollection in the contemplative life that you will nourish as teachers. Later in this course, when we study Plato's Meno in particular, you'll hear more about anamnesis, or recollection. And there, as we read the myth that Plato tells us about anamnesis, you may think it is a rather childlike, superstitious, or fanciful notion, certainly not having much relevance or application to the real world, let alone coming to know thyself. But there you'd be wrong. Voegelin's own anamnetic experiments that he records for us in these short recollections of his earliest childhood memories provide us with a model for our own experiments with anamnesis, or anamnetic knowing. Our own childhood memories are very precious and important, as are the memories that our students carry with them. What I find particularly evocative about Vogelin's anamnetic experiments is how they link our deepest knowing to childhood memories. Not to being a rigorous logician or problem solver, and certainly not to being an adult, or being mature, or growing into an old fart. When I think about how precious are our memories of childhood for the happiness we can find throughout the rest of our lives, I'm reminded of a sweet passage from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. It appears right near the end of the novel, where the one brother Alyosha is addressing a crowd of boys who have come to pay their respects at a funeral for another little boy. Alyosha tells them, "My dear children, perhaps you will not understand what I'm going to say to you, because I often speak very incomprehensibly. But still, you will remember and someday agree with my words. You must know that there is nothing higher, or stronger, or sounder, or more useful afterwards in life than some good memory, especially a memory from childhood, from the parental home. You hear a lot said about your education, yet some such beautiful sacred memory, preserved from childhood, is perhaps the best education. If a man stores up many such memories to take into life, then he is saved for his whole life. And even if only one good memory remains with us in our hearts, that alone may serve some day for our salvation." As teachers, let's all try to be among those good memories for our students. Honestly, from Alyosha's perspective, and what I say here might be inflammatory and irresponsible from the point of view of a B.Ed program, what good does it do to worry so much about math or science or literacy or all the other disciplines with their learning goals if we fail to nurture, or if a child cannot recall, a single good memory? There are in childhood the basic seeds for all of our wide-eyed and most wonderful kinds of knowing. Perhaps as young children, we're much more open and receptive to experiences of wonder in the world. Perhaps we are, in some ways, able to see more as children than we do as adults. Perhaps there are certain originary experiences we have when we're children that we become hardened to as we grow older. Maybe we forget such things, or even fall into danger of forgetting what it feels like to have such experiences. Do you remember any such things? Any seeings or feelings that perhaps still rest deep and precious and hidden within you? Perhaps long ago we felt at one with the world, whereas now we only feel alienated and stand apart. Perhaps once we felt a keen personal and intimate relation with nature or with the divine even, whereas now we feel somehow numbed, or like we know so many more things but have lost the heart of what we knew when our knowing was simpler and more immediate. Vogelin's sharing of his deepest, earliest memories with us kind of reminds me of that. This deep, originary experience, and these experiences are the well source for all non-dogmatic metaphysics and philosophy and religion. They are where we turn, in large measure, when we seek to know ourselves. Maybe some of you have an inkling of such things, and wish to explore the significance of these experiences in your own journaling for our class. Vogelin prefaces his own foray into journaling with the following caveats, however. First, he says that when we engage in anamnetic experimentation, we must assume that our consciousness is not constituted as a stream within the eye. That is, consciousness isn't just a subjective thing. It's It's not just a localized or internal thing that happens up in your melon. It isn't just you. Consciousness is bigger than just what you think, or you feel, or you experience. After all, you're conscious of something, eh? What are you conscious of? Not just yourself, man. You're conscious of reality. Consciousness connects you with everything else. So consciousness is not just the stream of your own thoughts, or your I. Second, Vogelin says that in its intentional function, consciousness in finite experience transcends into the world. Now, what the hell does that mean? It means that you are conscious of not just yourself, but of what is not yourself. You're conscious of other folks, of things, of animals, of the sky, of images, of the world, of all sorts of things. Consciousness of such things opens you up to what is not yourself. You transcend yourself through your consciousness. You participate in the whole of things through consciousness. Third, consciousness gets you in touch with your body, with the external world, with community, with history, and even with the ground of being, or what some folks call God. Moreover, all these connections we feel, or intimate, or experience through consciousness antecede or come before any of our reflections on consciousness. We can't really reflect on too much if we don't cultivate our memories and sensitivities or awareness towards all these experiences and rich aspects of our consciousness. Maybe that's why it's good to journal about them, eh? Fourth, any systematic reflection we might do in life has to draw upon these experiences and remembrances of consciousness as its source material. Journaling helps us remember these precious things, without which we wouldn't have anything to reflect upon. Maybe lots of folks have a hard time learning or seeing more or developing nuanced understandings simply because these rich memories haven't been nurtured in them. Maybe we could help young people save these important memories if we ask them to journal and to recollect or remember the manner of their participation in the various realms of being. Fifth, and finally, Vogelin points out that reflection on our recollected experiences of participation in the realms of being is a further event in the biography of consciousness that may itself lead us to deeper understandings of consciousness. I know what I just said is a bit hard to follow, but because this lecture is recorded, you can replay it again to see if you can get the gist of what Vogelin is telling us about the importance of recollection or anamnesis. If you're still struggling with it, don't worry. We'll revisit the notion of anamnesis when we come to Plato later in the course. Now, maybe one of the most famous journalers is Henry David Thoreau. Perhaps some of you have read Walden, or the story of Thoreau's personal excursion out into the woods, living all by himself, building his own cabin, living off the land, and practicing daily the life of mindful contemplation and activity. I first read this book when I was just a teenager. Honestly, I don't remember how I got turned on to it, but the experience of the book stuck with me. So that when I became a teacher later in life, I incorporated its study into my grade 11 English Language Arts program. I like Thoreau, and I recommend reading Walden from cover to cover someday when you have more time. But if you can find an hour to just taste his work right now, reading a few selections from Walden will be sufficient to give you the flavor of his own experimental attitude towards living. And there's much in Thoreau's experimentalism that reminds us of Gandhi, of Aurelius, or even of Nietzsche. Here, let me cite Thoreau's words to you about the value of experimentation for the education of students. Here he goes. I mean that they, like students, right, should not play life or study it merely while the community supports them at this expensive game, but earnestly live it from beginning to end. How could youths better learn to live than by at once trying the experiment of living? Methinks this would exercise their minds as much as mathematics. If I wished a boy to know something about the arts and sciences, for instance, I would not pursue the common course, which is merely to send him into the neighborhood of some professor where anything is professed and practiced, but the art of life. To survey the world through a telescope or a microscope, and never with his natural eye. To study chemistry, and not learn how bread is made, or mechanics, and not learn how it is earned. To discover new satellites to Neptune, and not detect the motes in his eyes, or to what vagabond he is a satellite himself, or to be devoured by the monsters that swarm all around him while contemplating the monsters in a drop of vinegar. Which would have advanced the most at the end of a month? The boy who had made his own jackknife from the ore which he had dug and smelted, reading as much as would be necessary for this? Or the boy who had attended the lectures on metallurgy at the Institute in the meanwhile and had received a Rogers penknife from his father? Who would be the more likely to cut his fingers? To my astonishment, I was informed on leaving college that I had studied navigation. Why, if I had taken one turn down the harbor, I should have known more about it. Taking up the experimental attitude, not living life from some objective point of view, external to life itself, as though that were really possible. Not taking up what Buber might call the I-it attitude of mastery towards everything around us always, but rather cultivating an I-thou relationship with the world and with one another. This is the reason to head out into the woods, I think. Thoreau writes very famously, here it is, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole argument, or rather, why to get to the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. What better reason can you think of for writing or doing anything than to follow in Thoreau's footsteps, seeking out a genuine education about things in order to know oneself? And I'd ask you this next question specifically. Do you think that such ramblings and such desires to know are only fit and appropriate for the sufficiently mature? Or do they not also have their place among the young, among those still perhaps inclined to wonder at the world, and among those who maybe find something not quite to their tastes about this adult life into which they're being so quickly ushered and expected to conform? Can you lead your own students productively in Thoreauvian experimentations? Written much in the same spirit as Thoreau's Walden, we have Annie Dillard's wonderful book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Annie Dillard is just about my favorite author, I'd say. She wrote Pilgrim when she was only 27 years old. That is humbling to a fool like me. And she started writing in the same year that I was born, which, for me at least, makes the connection I feel with her all the more potent. Annie Dillard is so smart and so insightful, ladies and gentlemen. She's so articulate, so sensitive, and so perceptive and open in ways that never cease to astonish me every time I open up one of her books. Dillard truly has the poet's inspired vision and the seer's second sight. There is such giftedness in her lines of prose. When I read Dillard, it makes me wish I could see what she sees and hear what she hears and feel what she feels. Listening to her words is like tapping into a direct line to that inaudible music of the spheres that a man could hear if only his own physical ears were not such crude and coarse instruments. Dillard gives me hope when I read her, because she articulates intimations of a transcendent beauty that I know somehow, perhaps through my own anamnetic experiences, but that has, for whatever reasons, faded largely from my own consciousness, so that I feel very much like a calloused foot tightly sealed within a work boot walking across a beach, and at the same time trying to feel the sand between my toes while only perhaps hearing the surf rumble and crash in the far distance. Annie Dillard stirs up anamnetic experiences. If you read her, I hope very much she rattles you like she rattles me. I think she's the most wonderful teacher. The selections I've included for you from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek are valuable for teachers because they detail the inquiries of an artist who is primarily a scientist. Now, I get a kick out of that. It's surprising to me how Dillard doesn't twitter away about art and poetry and literature in her journaling efforts while she's out on her pilgrimage along Tinker Creek. No, she's a scientist through and through. Certainly she's well-read. She's crazy well-read, I'd say, especially for a 27-year-old. What's so beautiful to me about her is how she's so inquisitive and attentive with regard to the natural world. She is a keen biologist and observer. She performs experiment after experiment in the woods near the creek. She observes, she listens, she waits, and she wonders. And she writes about her wonderings. But Dillard's wonderings explode in the direction of philosophizing rather than focusing down narrowly upon a point, as do those narrowed and specific questions and inquiries of the pure scientist. I shared Dillard with you in order to invite you to think about just what the difference is between scientific inquiry on the one hand and philosophic inquiry on the other. The scientist proceeds on the assumption that the mind is capable of finding out the answers to whatever questions the scientist poses. It would be kind of dumb, after all, for the scientist, or for anyone for that matter, to ask a question that had no answer, or that was beyond the mind's capacity. Philosophers and theologians from the medieval period called the mind's capacity to know or to learn about everything that is its capax omnium. And again, the scientific pursuit of truth rests upon the premise that whatever is can be known. Things that are truly are. We come to know them by knowing the truth about them. Put another way, truth is the image of being in the realm of the intelligible. Put yet another way, truth is the manner of our mind's participation in what is. A.G. Serdelange explains by saying, the order of the mind must correspond to the order of things. Science therefore proceeds on the assumption that answers to the specialized questions it poses are capable of being known. Philosophy, by contrast, is sensitive to the fact that, well, yes, we ask questions about what is, expecting answers to our questions. There's also a deep sense in which everything and everyone is fundamentally a deep mystery to us. Thomas Aquinas spoke long ago of this incomprehensibility of what is by using the image of a tiny fly. We can study a fly's biology, its movements, physical characteristics, its lifespan. We can even know nowadays, we can map its DNA, right? And its molecular structure if we want. But the fly's isness, that miracle of existence that is the fly itself, the totality of the fly and its being, we can't know that. Always eludes us. What a marvelous thing is a tiny little fly. And if the fly is incomprehensible in this way, how much more is everything else deeply steeped and anchored in such mysteries of being? Does that excite you? These mysteries are what we find exploding in Dillard's writing as well. While Dillard is a wonderful scientist, it seems to me that all of her scientific investigations become springboards to grander questions, where the strict scientist necessarily mitigates any need to recognize the incomprehensibility of what is by restricting and focusing her inquiry within a specific field or branch of scientific endeavor. But the philosopher, by contrast, accepts no such restriction, and hence must always encounter the unfathomable nature of being. This is what Annie Dillard does time and time again in her own deep and wondering questions and encounters with nature and the natural world. Where scientific inquiry involves asking a specific question about a specific aspect of being, for instance, the chemist asks questions about the chemical compositions of things, right? Philosophy, by contrast, asks questions about the totality of being. What is the nature of being as such? This is not a question the scientist asks. Or rather, she may ask such questions, but the moment she does, she becomes a philosopher, not a scientist. Through attentive study, the scientist might come into possession of a definitive knowledge that satisfies and eliminates the need to ask a specific question, but which might also explode into 1,000 new questions. But the philosopher's question is never so answered, since philosophic inquiry does not simply attend to a single aspect of what can be known, but it rather seeks out a full knowledge of the totality. Put another way, Dillard, the philosophizing journaler, displays a greater degree of openness to what is than does the scientist. The difference between scientific and philosophic inquiry is a function of their respective openness or receptivity to things. In science, unlike in philosophy, this openness is necessarily incomplete, since each branch of science selects the range of objects in its field, as well as the methods by which it chooses to investigate those objects. Philosophy, by contrast, demands a more complete and profound openness and silence than does science. Philosophy means to listen so perfectly and intensely that the silence isn't disturbed and interrupted by anything, not even by a question. This is the precise difference between the individual sciences and philosophy. Science does not remain silent. It asks questions. It's the very nature of its questions that establishes a particular branch of science. Now let me ask you this question. How silent are you able to be in your journaling efforts? How good of a listener can you be as a teacher? How keenly do you listen to your subject or subjects? And how keenly can you listen to your students? How deeply can you hear and understand and plumb the depths and mystery of those beings who present themselves to you each and every day in your classes? Will you be content to know your students by what they demonstrate to you on their tests, in their assignments? Will their marks and how they succeed or fail to hit the prescribed outcomes and objectives in the program of studies define for you the nature of their being? Will you see only this facade of who they are, this cheap, false image? Will you teach them to only value themselves by what this cheap, false image of assessments and marks and grades tells them about themselves? Or will you bear witness to the deep mystery that is their being? Will you be able to attune yourself to this deep mystery? Will you glory in it? Will you teach them not to be fooled or deceived by the appearances and the shallow judgments of schooling that lay claim to naming what they are? Will you teach them to listen deeply for silence, and in that silence to hear something, or to intimate something of the mystery and the wonder of what they truly are? This is your power as a teacher. One final author I would recommend to you is Henry Bugbee. If you still have the energy or the inclination, try reading the excerpts I've provided for you from his journals, which go by the name of The Inward Mourning. Thoreau talks of this inward mourning in his own work. He writes, "All poets and heroes, like Memnon, are the children of Aurora, and emit their music at sunrise. To him whose elastic and vigorous thoughts keep pace with the sun, the day is a perpetual morning. It matters not what the clocks say, or the attitudes and labors of men. Morning is when I am awake, and there is dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. Why is it that men give so poor an account of their day if they have not been slumbering? They are not such poor calculators. If they had not been overcome with drowsiness, they would have performed something. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for an effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I've never yet met a man who was quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face? We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture, or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour. If we refused, or rather used up such paltry information as we get, the oracles would distinctly inform us how this might be done. I love and deeply appreciate this image of awakening and of morning in Thoreau's journals. It's a powerful metaphor for genuine education, waking up from that sleep that is ignorance, or from that life that is like sleep. And it resonates very well with what you'll read in Plato's Apology, where Socrates describes his own vocation as one who goes about like a stinging fly, biting the necks and arses of his students, trying to awaken them from their sloth and their slumbers. And how often do you find this image of the sleepwalker or the sleeper an apt description of your own life and your own daily experience? Do you catch yourself from moment to moment, aware and then unaware or inattentive to the people before you, to the task at hand, to all the beauty and the goodness that lies before you for your appreciation and your thankfulness? How much of life is lived almost as though we are sleeping? Thinking about such things reminds me of a play I've loved by Thornton Wilder entitled Our Town. In that play, towards the end, several of the characters in the small town of Grover's Corners have died. As the audience, we get to hear from them again, but this time from an eternal perspective beyond the grave. That is, we hear the long dead talking with one another, or with one of the more recently deceased, a young girl named Emily. Emily finds out about the possibility, as one who is dead, of revisiting and reliving any memory of what has transpired in the field of time. Although the others warn her against it, she indulges her curiosity and her desire to relive some of that life which she once knew while she was alive. She chooses a relatively insignificant event, one of her birthdays, as a point of recollection. And in doing so, from her eternal point of view, that is to say, from the vantage point of one who is awakened to all that we piss and squander during our vain days under the sun, Emily is overwrought by the folly of the living, mortal sleepwalking existence. Calling out to her mother in the scene she espies, Emily says, "Oh, Mama, just look at me 1 minute, as though you really saw me. Mama, 14 years have gone by, I'm dead. You're a grandmother, Mama. I married George Gibbs, Mama. Wally's dead too. Mommy, his appendix burst on a camping trip to North Conway. We felt just terrible about it. Don't you remember? But just for a moment, now we're all together, Mama. Just for a moment, we're happy. Let's look at one another." As the scene plays on, such a simple scene from an ordinary day in any of our ordinary existences, Emily grows more distraught at the folly of living beings. In a loud voice to the stage manager, she shouts, I can't go on. It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another." And then she breaks down sobbing. But she goes on, "I didn't realize. So all that was going on and we never noticed. Take me back up the hill to my grave. But wait, first, one more look. Goodbye. Goodbye, world. Goodbye, Grover's Corners. Mama and Papa. Goodbye to clocks ticking and Mama's sunflowers and food and coffee and new iron dresses and hot baths and sleeping and waking up. Oh, Earth, you're too wonderful for anybody to realize you. Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute?" Bugby's journals are very much about these self-same concerns. Rather than recapitulate their contents here, I give you instead this longer quote from Our Town because it illustrates so well the deep elements of education, the most essential component for our happiness and for the happiness of our students. Namely, that aim we all ought to have and to affirm, like Nietzsche, the value of this existence we are granted. That gift that is our own life, no matter how long it may last, or how full or empty of hardships it might be. Awakening to the meaning and the value of this life we are given, ladies and gentlemen, nowhere will you find that in the general outcomes of the various programs of studies. You just simply won't find that. And yet, what a hollow and empty education in life a person leads if he or she hasn't made some efforts or had some inclination to seek out the truth of such things. Can you find ways to make whatever you do in your classes in some way an avenue for your students towards such discoveries? Can you order your own teachings in such a way as to promote such inquiry and such a demand to awaken for your own self and for your own edification? It seems to me that this will be very important for you as teachers who do not simply teach as a job, but teach where teaching is truly a way of life, steeped in both its active and contemplative components. Now you've been initiated into the wonders of journaling, ladies and gentlemen. Now you've heard about and hopefully read some of the selections from these wonderfully gifted and insightful writers. Now the empty page of your own journal lies waiting for you to write the story of your own life and your own consciousness in participation with the full panoply of being and what is. Develop a depth of attunement to things and to your connections with the rest of the world. Develop an attitude of listening in silence to others and to what lies before you. Spy out its gifts. Record your observations. Recollect your beginning to know your end. Good luck.